The board believed Mason Reed was nothing more than a broke single father, a contract maintenance man tucked quietly into the far corner of Hangar 9. When the $300 million test jet refused to wake up after a routine upgrade, they replaced him with an engineering team that cost $50 million. For 3 days, every system stayed dark, silent, dead. Then, with the CEO facing the loss of the largest defense contract in company history, the jet lit up the instant Mason placed his hand on the panel and spoke 4 quiet words that froze the hangar. Rain fell heavy over Langford Aerospace, on the morning everything was supposed to go right. Hangar 9 stood lit from end to end, every floodlight trained on the sleek frame of the Aegis test jet, a machine that had cost the company $300 million to build and nearly as much in promises to a defense delegation that would be watching within hours. Engineers in clean uniforms moved with rehearsed precision around the aircraft, checking readouts, murmuring into headsets, treating the morning like a coronation rather than a test. Amelia Langford arrived flanked by board members, internal media handlers, and senior staff, her heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that matched the tension rising through the building. At the far edge of the hangar, away from the cameras and the polished shoes, stood Mason Reed in a faded maintenance jacket, watching a secondary control panel that nobody else seemed to notice. He had been there since before dawn, quiet, unbothered by the noise around him, the way a man behaves when he already knows something the room has not yet discovered. Jackson Vale, the technical director, passed him without a glance, then turned back just long enough to remark to a colleague that the man by the wall was good for changing bolts and topping off oil, nothing more. When the lead technical crew finally pushed the activation sequence, the jet responded with a stutter instead of a roar. Cabin lights flickered erratically, the turbine refused to spin past its idle threshold, and the main control display froze mid-render, locking on a string of characters no one in the room recognized. A murmur spread through the gathered executives, the kind of sound that precedes panic in rooms full of people who are paid to project confidence. Mason's eyes narrowed at the rhythm of the failed startup, the half-second hesitation before the freeze, a pattern that did not belong to a mechanical fault at all. He moved a few steps closer, close enough to speak without shouting, and told Amelia that forcing a second ignition attempt would only deepen whatever the system was rejecting. His voice was even, careful, the voice of someone trying to prevent a mistake rather than claim credit for noticing one. Jackson cut him off before Amelia could respond, telling the room that maintenance staff did not dictate testing procedure, and that the schedule could not bend for guesswork from a man with grease still on his hands. The board, already strained by the weight of the morning, treated Mason's interruption as a distraction rather than a warning. Amelia, caught between the ticking clock and the optics of a delegation due within hours, gave the order to clear non-essential personnel from the primary floor, and Mason was among the names read aloud. Security approached him without hostility, simply following instruction, and he did not argue or raise his voice, only nodded once and stepped back toward the access corridor while the rest of the engineers resumed their attempts at the dead aircraft. Before he reached the door, Mason allowed himself one last look at the jet, and something on the secondary display caught his attention through the chaos. A small symbol buried deep in the diagnostic layer that almost no one would have known to search for. It was an old marking, one that belonged to a classified testing program that had existed years earlier, before contracts changed hands and records were quietly rewritten, a program from which his own name had been erased. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, the rain still drumming against the metal roof above him, before turning and walking out into the gray morning, leaving behind a jet that nobody yet understood was not broken at all, only refusing to trust the hands now on it. By mid-morning, Jackson Vale had called an emergency meeting and was already constructing a narrative that placed the blame squarely on the maintenance department's low-level oversight, a narrative that conveniently kept his own division untouched. Mason was summoned into the glass-walled conference room, brought before the assembled board as though he were the source of the malfunction rather than the man who had tried to stop it from worsening. Questions came fast, sharp, dismissive, the kind designed to corner rather than understand, and Mason answered each one without flinching, his voice steady, even as the room treated him like a suspect. He explained, as simply as he could, that the failure did not originate in the engine or the fuel lines, but somewhere deeper, in what he called the system's identification chain, a layer most of the people in that room had never been trained to consider. Before anyone could press further, a screen at the end of the table lit up with the face of Connor Blake, the senior lead of the newly contracted engineering team, a man whose confidence filled the room before his expertise had a chance to prove itself. Connor promised, with the easy certainty of someone who had never been wrong in front of an audience, that his team could have the aircraft fully operational within 24 hours. Eleanor Grant, never one to wait for sentiment when numbers were on the line, pressed Amelia hard to sign off on the outside contract immediately, framing it as the only responsible move left to protect the company's defense partnership. Amelia, exhausted and cornered by a ticking deadline, gave the approval, and within minutes Mason's access credentials to the hangar were deactivated on every terminal in the building. Jackson could not resist a final remark as the meeting closed, commenting that a single father with a wrench was no match for a room full of doctorate-level engineers, a line that drew a few uncomfortable laughs from people who knew better but said nothing. Mason did not argue the point, did not raise his voice, did not ask for a chance to prove himself in front of the very people who had just dismissed him. He simply gathered his old tool bag from beneath the workbench where it had sat for years and walked out of the room with the same composure he had carried in, the kind of stillness that unsettled people more than anger would have. Amelia watched him go, noticing something she could not quite name, a calm in him that did not match the situation, the kind of calm that usually belonged to someone who had already survived something worse than public humiliation. One of the younger security staff, watching from the corridor, lowered his eyes as Mason passed, aware that this was the same man who had spent countless unpaid nights keeping the aircraft stable through earlier testing phases that never made it into any official report. Mason crossed the rain-slick parking lot toward his truck, and somewhere between the building and the gate his phone buzzed once with a short call from the hospital regarding an outstanding balance tied to his daughter's care, a detail he absorbed quietly before sliding the phone back into his pocket, refusing to let it show on his face. The reason behind his quiet endurance was never spoken aloud in that hangar, but it sat in him like ballast, steady and unseen. Behind him, the new engineering team arrived to applause, their equipment cases rolling across the polished floor like a procession, while Mason stood outside the gate in the rain, looking back at the jet through the glass the way a person looks at an old friend who has just been handed over to strangers who do not yet understand what it took to earn its trust. Connor Blake arrived the following morning with 12 hand-picked engineers, crates of diagnostic hardware, scanning rigs, simulation software, and small robotic inspectors capable of crawling across the wings and engine housings inch by inch. The hangar transformed almost overnight into something closer to a research facility than a maintenance bay. Screens stacked on portable racks, cables looping across the floor, every surface of the Aegis jet wrapped in sensors meant to capture data that no human eye could catch. Connor walked the floor with the energy of a man who believed certainty could be purchased, and for the first several hours it looked as though it could. They stripped the control panel down to its housing, tested the fuel lines under pressure, ran full diagnostics on the electrical architecture, and traced every data pathway twice over for good measure. Every component returned a clean result, flawless readings across the board, and yet the jet remained as unresponsive as it had been the day before, a silence that no spreadsheet could explain. Connor, unwilling to accept that the problem might sit outside his frame of reference, declared the issue a software fault and ordered his team to push a freshly built control package directly into the aircraft's core systems. The moment the new package loaded, the cabin lights cut out entirely, and seconds later an error string surfaced on the main display that matched nothing in any technical manual the team carried with them. Jackson, watching from the observation deck, felt the first genuine flicker of fear pass through him, though he masked it quickly before Amelia could notice the shift in his expression. When Amelia demanded an honest assessment of where things stood, Connor offered only reassurances wrapped in technical language, insisting that more time was all the situation required, a phrase that was beginning to wear thin against the ticking clock of the defense delegation's arrival. Miles away, in a modest garage on the edge of the city, Mason worked beneath the hood of an aging aircraft engine for a struggling shop owner who could not afford a proper repair service, the kind of work that paid little but kept his hands steady and his bills slightly more manageable. A former colleague called him that evening, voice tight with concern, warning him that the new team was reaching into the core systems without understanding what they were actually touching. Mason listened without interrupting, then said quietly that if they kept forcing the system the way they were, the Aegis jet would lock itself down completely beyond anyone's reach, including his own. There was no satisfaction in his voice as he said it, only the tired certainty of a man watching a mistake unfold from a distance he had not chosen for himself. He understood that aircraft better than anyone left standing in that hangar, understood its quirks and its stubbornness in a way that no amount of expensive equipment could replicate, and still he made no move to return, unwilling to walk back into a place that had erased his name as easily as it had erased his title. The call ended, and Mason returned to the engine in front of him, hands moving with quiet familiarity, while far across the city a different machine refused to forgive the hands now upon it. Back in Hangar 9, as the night crew prepared to rotate out, a red warning light bloomed across the length of the jet's fuselage, steady and unmistakable, displaying two words that none of Connor's software had predicted and none of his engineers could explain away: core recognition failure. Amelia stayed at the office through the night, the defense contract worth billions spread across her desk like a verdict waiting to be read, every clause a reminder of how much rested on a machine that would not wake. She summoned Jackson and demanded the complete maintenance history of the Aegis jet, every log, every entry, every name attached to every repair stretching back to the program's earliest days. What came back surprised her more than she expected, a record showing that across the previous 6 months, only one person had consistently resolved the aircraft's recurring small failures, and that name was Mason Reed. She noticed something else buried in the timestamps: entries logged at 2 and 3 in the morning, repairs that never appeared in any official report filed by the primary engineering staff. Jackson tried to wave it off, calling it minor tinkering, the kind of busy work that fell naturally to maintenance personnel. But Amelia had already begun cross-referencing the entries against manual command lines that did not match any documentation issued by the company. Connor, reviewing the same logs from his side of the investigation, uncovered an older identification layer buried beneath the current operating system, a layer that behaved almost as though it remembered a single original operator. His team referred to it dismissively as legacy interference, a relic that should have been wiped clean during the last system overhaul, except that nothing they tried could remove it. When Connor attempted to override the layer directly, the aircraft responded by triggering a full protective lockdown, sealing every control surface and refusing further input from any terminal in the hangar. Amelia asked, more forcefully this time, who had originally designed that identification layer, and the silence that followed told her more than any answer could have. A senior technician, older than most in the room and less concerned with politics than survival, mentioned quietly that long before Langford Aerospace acquired the program, an earlier testing division had been dissolved following an accident that the company rarely discussed in public records. Amelia pulled at that thread carefully, requesting archived personnel files from the original Aegis development team, files that had clearly been touched and reorganized at some point after their creation. Buried within an old archived list, half obscured by a redaction that someone had applied imperfectly, was the name Mason Reed, struck from the roster of lead engineers without explanation. She sat with that discovery for a long moment, the hum of the building's ventilation the only sound in the otherwise empty office, the weight of what she was beginning to understand settling over her slowly. The man she had personally authorized to be removed from the hangar, the man Jackson had mocked in front of the entire board, was not simply a contractor who happened to be good with his hands. Somewhere in the gap between the official story and the redacted files lay a version of events that nobody currently employed at Langford Aerospace seemed eager to revisit, and Amelia found herself staring at his name on the screen, recognizing for the first time that the man she had dismissed might be the only person who had ever truly understood the machine, now refusing to answer anyone else. Outside her window, the city had gone quiet, the kind of stillness that only settles in after midnight, when even the most ambitious offices empty out and leave behind nothing but the glow of unfinished work. Amelia poured herself coffee she would not finish and read the archived file twice more, searching for a detail she might have missed, some clerical explanation that would make the redaction feel ordinary rather than deliberate. None came. Instead, the longer she stared at the gap where Mason's title should have been, the more she became convinced that someone had worked carefully to ensure his name would never surface again, and that someone had very likely still been employed at the company when the records were altered. The story shifted late that night to the small garage on the edge of town, where Mason worked beneath a single hanging light, rebuilding an old engine entirely by hand, without the help of any modern diagnostic tool. There was a rhythm to his movements that came only from years of repetition, the kind of muscle memory that survives long after a career has ended on paper, and as he worked, fragments of an earlier life surfaced in his mind unbidden. Years before, Mason had been a promising young engineer on the original Aegis program, working under a man named David Mercer, building systems meant to protect aircraft from exactly the kind of failure now playing out in Hangar 9. It was Mason who had designed the early identification protocol, meant to prevent the jet from being seized or operated remotely by anyone outside its intended chain of command, a safeguard born from a near disaster that had nearly cost the program everything. After a testing accident years earlier, the leadership of that era had needed someone to blame quickly, someone whose removal would protect the company's stock price more than the truth would, and Mason's team had been the convenient answer. He had not caused the accident. In fact, his quick response in the moment had prevented it from becoming a far larger catastrophe, but the official record never reflected that detail. His file was scrubbed, his patents quietly reassigned under the company's name, and he was pushed out of an industry that had once felt like the only place he belonged. At the time, Mason chose silence over a fight he could not afford both financially and emotionally, with a family member's medical bills mounting and no resources left for a prolonged legal battle against a corporation with far deeper pockets than his own. In the years since, he had taken on whatever technical work he could find, never advertising what he once built, never explaining to strangers why a man with his skill was found in garages and side jobs instead of corner offices. David Mercer appeared at the garage that night, older now, walking with the careful gait of a man who had retired but never quite let go of what he used to protect. He warned Mason that Langford would come looking for him eventually, once every other option had been exhausted, because desperation has a way of remembering what convenience once tried to forget. Mason replied simply that he owed the company nothing, that whatever debt might have existed between them had been settled the day they erased his name from a project he had nearly given everything to save. David did not argue the point directly, only said that whatever Mason might or might not owe Langford, the aircraft itself still carried something inside it that Mason had built specifically to protect human lives, a purpose that did not disappear simply because ownership had changed hands. The words settled over Mason in a way he did not immediately respond to, and after David left he stood alone in the quiet garage for a long while before walking to a closet in the back room and pulling down an old metal box he had not opened in years. Inside lay the original blueprints for the Aegis system, hand-annotated in his own writing, and beside them an engineer's identification card that had been cut cleanly in half, a small and deliberate cruelty from a chapter of his life he had tried hard not to revisit. At Langford headquarters, Eleanor Grant called an emergency board session, her tone leaving no room for debate about how serious the situation had become. The company's stock had fallen sharply overnight, and outside reporting had already begun questioning whether the entire Aegis program was little more than an expensive illusion propped up for investors. Word arrived that the defense delegation intended to conduct its final evaluation within 36 hours, a window that left almost no margin for further failure. If the jet did not start by then, the contract would collapse entirely, and Amelia understood clearly that her position as chief executive would likely collapse along with it. Jackson, sensing the direction of the room, pushed hard for Connor's team to remain in full control of the situation, conveniently avoiding any mention of Mason's connection to the aircraft's original design. Amelia, for the first time in years of working alongside him, found herself unable to fully trust a word coming out of Jackson's mouth. She requested Mason's complete personnel file, only to discover that several sections remained sealed under an old legal order she had never been told existed, a quiet inconvenience that felt far too deliberate to be accidental. Later that evening, an email arrived in her inbox from an address she did not recognize, sent by David Mercer, containing only a single line that read, "You replaced the only person this jet has ever trusted." The sentence stayed with her long after she closed the message, returning to her thoughts at odd moments throughout the night. She made her way down to the company archive personally, bypassing the usual request process, and there, buried among older technical files, she found Mason's engineering signature embedded directly within the aircraft's core design documents, though the listed ownership had been quietly changed to another name at some point after the files were created. The discrepancy was small enough to have gone unnoticed by anyone not specifically searching for it, but large enough to confirm everything she had begun to suspect. Mason had not simply maintained this aircraft over the years. Long before that, he had been the one who saved it. Amelia stood in the archive room for a long while, the cold fluorescent light overhead casting flat shadows across rows of forgotten file boxes. Feeling the full shape of what had been hidden from her settle into place. She thought of Jackson's dismissive remarks in front of the board, of the casual cruelty with which Mason had been escorted out of the building, and of how easily the company had discarded the one person who understood the jet at its deepest level. Without informing the board or returning to her office, she walked out to her car in the rain, leaving Jackson and the rest of the executives still arguing behind closed doors, and drove toward the address listed on an old maintenance contract, toward the small garage on the edge of the city where she hoped Mason would still be willing to listen. The drive gave her time to rehearse what she might say, though every version sounded hollow against the scale of what had actually happened. She passed darkened storefronts and empty intersections, the wipers beating a steady rhythm against the windshield, and somewhere in that quiet stretch of road she stopped thinking like a chief executive trying to save a contract and started thinking like a person who owed someone an apology that no amount of money could properly deliver. By the time she reached the edge of the city, the rain had thinned to a fine mist, and the glow of a single garage light ahead told her that Mason, as always, was still awake and still working. Amelia stepped out of her car into the quiet of the garage lot, struck immediately by how ordinary everything around her looked, nothing like the polished world she had left behind at headquarters. Through the open bay door she saw Mason bent over an engine, hands stained with grease, completely unhurried, as though the financial collapse threatening to unfold few hours away belonged to a different universe entirely. He looked up when her shadow crossed the threshold, recognized her instantly, and returned his attention to the engine without any visible surprise. She tried to hold on to the composure she carried into every boardroom, offering him a generous compensation package to return immediately and resolve the crisis at Hangar 9. Mason wiped his hands on a rag and told her plainly that the issue had never been about money, a response that left her without an easy follow-up. She offered an apology for the way the board had treated him, but he did not accept it quickly, the kind of hesitation that comes from years of broken trust rather than simple stubbornness. He reminded her that Langford only ever called him an engineer when the company needed someone to blame, and only ever called him an engineer again when it needed someone to save them, a pattern he had lived through once already and had no interest in repeating. Amelia had no real defense against the observation, and she let the silence sit between them rather than fill it with something dishonest. Mason explained, without any trace of mysticism, that the Aegis jet did not simply prefer him out of sentiment. It operated on an identification protocol built around a specific sequence of motion, sound, and pressure, details that had been stripped from the official documentation long before the current engineering team ever touched the aircraft. She asked why he had not explained this clearly from the very beginning, back when the failure first appeared in front of the entire board. Mason answered that he had tried, but that very few people take seriously the words of a man wearing an old maintenance jacket, regardless of how carefully he chooses them. Amelia lowered her voice, admitting for the first time that she had been wrong, and reminding him gently that thousands of employees stood to lose their jobs if the jet remained silent through the delegation's final inspection. Mason still declined, unwilling to step back into a place that had once dismantled his career and his reputation, without hesitation or apology. He told her, without bitterness but without softness either, that some doors deserved to stay closed even when the consequences of leaving them shut were significant. Amelia accepted his answer without arguing further, understanding that pressure alone had never been the right tool to use with this particular man. Before she left, she set a folder down on his workbench, a copy of the altered accident report from years earlier, complete with a signature she had only recently confirmed did not belong to the person it claimed to represent. She said nothing more about it, simply turned and walked back out into the night, leaving Mason standing alone beneath the single hanging light with the folder unopened in front of him, the rain outside finally beginning to ease. Mason opened the folder Amelia had left behind once the sound of her car had faded down the road, and as he read through the altered accident report, the forged signature buried within it became unmistakable to him almost immediately. Back during the original accident, Jackson had not yet held the title of technical director, but he had already been the man responsible for managing the testing data, a position that gave him quiet access to records most people never thought to question. Mason understood now, with a clarity that felt almost cold, that Jackson had been the one who erased his name from the system years ago, clearing the path for his own rise within the company. Back in Hangar 9, Connor continued pushing forward, attempting to replace the aircraft's identification module entirely in a final effort to force compliance from a system that had already made its resistance clear. The jet reacted violently this time, locking the fuel lines, sealing the hydraulic valves, and cutting power to every auxiliary system at once, a cascading shutdown that startled even the most confident members of Connor's team. One engineer narrowly avoided injury when a wing lift mechanism dropped unexpectedly during the chaos, though thankfully no one was seriously hurt in the incident. Amelia, arriving back at the hangar just in time to witness the aftermath, ordered every operation halted immediately, but Jackson pushed back hard, terrified of what further investigation might reveal about his own past involvement. David Mercer arrived shortly after, walking directly toward Jackson with the steady determination of a man who had waited far too long for this particular conversation. David stated plainly, in front of witnesses, that the Aegis jet was not malfunctioning at all, but actively defending itself against a chain of commands it correctly identified as illegitimate. Jackson attempted to have David removed from the premises, raising his voice in a way that drew attention from everyone still working the floor, but Amelia stepped between them and refused to allow it. In the middle of the rising tension, Mason finally called Amelia directly, his voice calm but firm, warning her that one more attempt to force the aircraft's core systems would result in a permanent lockdown that no one, including himself, would be able to reverse. Amelia asked him directly what it would take to bring him back into the building, expecting another refusal or a negotiation over money neither of them particularly cared about. Mason surprised her by asking for nothing financial at all. Instead, he requested that the original accident file be reopened, that the names of his former team be properly restored to the historical record, and that he be granted full authority over the aircraft once he returned to the hangar floor. Amelia agreed without hesitation, understanding that this was the only path remaining that offered any real chance of saving the contract and, more importantly, of correcting a wrong that had gone unaddressed for years. She walked back into the boardroom where the rest of the executives were still arguing among themselves, and in a tone that left no room for further debate, announced that Mason Reed would be returning to Hangar 9, this time not as a contractor standing at the edge of the room, but as the person the entire project now depended on completely. Mason walked back into Hangar 9 the following morning, no longer the overlooked maintenance contractor people had stepped around for years, but the only remaining hope of saving an aircraft that had defeated everyone else who had tried to wake it. Connor's team eyed him with open suspicion, the kind of skepticism reserved for outsiders who had not earned a seat at their table through credentials or pedigree. Connor himself asked, loudly enough for the whole floor to hear, why anyone should defer to a man whose name did not even appear in the current engineering registry. Mason did not argue the point or attempt to defend himself verbally. Instead, he simply asked that every signal jamming and interference device surrounding the jet be powered down completely before he began. He walked the length of the aircraft slowly, pressing his palm against a handful of very specific points along the fuselage, listening closely to the faint expansion of metal under tension and the subtle scent of ozone drifting from the electrical bay near the rear panel. Connor let out a short laugh, remarking that Mason looked more like a fortune teller than an engineer. Mason responded without raising his voice, calmly identifying 3 precise mistakes Connor's team had made over the previous days, citing the exact minutes those mistakes appeared in the system logs with an accuracy that left no room for dispute. A heavy silence settled across the hangar as everything he said checked out against the recorded data, undeniable and exact. Amelia stood near the back of the room, watching the gap widen between paper credentials and a genuine lived understanding of the machine in front of them. Mason then requested access to a secondary control panel that had been entirely omitted from the newer technical documentation, a section most of the current team did not even know existed. Inside it, sealed beneath an older marking from the original Aegis program, sat a cluster of wiring that had clearly been left untouched for years. Jackson's face drained of color as Mason reached toward it, and he moved quickly to stop him, his urgency revealing far more than his words ever could have. Mason looked directly at Jackson and said, evenly, that the only person in that hangar afraid of the jet starting was not someone trying to save it. The accusation landed heavily across the room, and several engineers exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that something larger than a technical failure was finally surfacing in front of them. Jackson opened his mouth to respond but found nothing convincing to say, and the silence that followed told its own story far more clearly than any argument could have. Mason set the old, cleanly cut identification card from his earlier years onto the main control panel, the same card David had once seen tucked away in a metal box in the back of his garage. He took a slow breath, glanced once toward Amelia for confirmation, and prepared to show the entire room a truth that the company had spent years trying to bury beneath new equipment, new contracts, and new excuses. The hangar held an unusual stillness as he worked, the kind that settles over a room once people stop performing confidence and start genuinely paying attention. Engineers who had arrived weeks earlier with expensive credentials and even more expensive equipment now leaned forward instead of dismissing him, watching every motion of his hands as though trying to memorize something they had never been taught. Connor, still proud but visibly shaken, said nothing further, and even Eleanor Grant, who had arrived quietly to observe the proceedings from a distance, folded her arms and waited without her usual impatience, sensing that whatever happened next would decide the company's fate far more than any boardroom vote ever could. Mason asked Amelia to order full video recording of everything about to happen, insisting that no one would have the chance to rewrite this version of events the way they had rewritten the last one. Amelia agreed without hesitation, instructing her assistant to begin recording in front of the board, the engineering team, the visiting defense delegation, and every staff member still present on the hangar floor. Mason did not reach for any of the expensive diagnostic equipment scattered around him. Instead, he picked up an old toolkit, a worn technical headset, and the original hand-drawn blueprint he had carried with him since leaving the garage that morning. He explained to the gathered crowd in plain and unhurried language that the Aegis jet had been deliberately designed to refuse activation whenever it detected a command sequence that did not match its trusted lineage. That protocol had been built years earlier, following an incident in which a separate military system had nearly been hijacked and operated remotely by unauthorized hands, an event that convinced the original engineering team that physical and behavioral verification mattered just as much as digital security. Jackson had tried years ago to erase Mason's name from every official document tied to the project, but he had never understood that the deepest layer of recognition did not live in paperwork at all. It lived in the physical architecture of the aircraft itself. Mason began the sequence methodically, cutting auxiliary power first, then opening a balance valve that had not been touched by anyone else in years, then placing his palm against the control panel in a rhythm that matched some internal memory only he seemed to carry. He entered a short manual code, then paused, waiting for a very specific response tone to rise from deep within the turbine housing, a sound few people in that hangar had ever heard before. For the first time in days, a thin line of blue light traveled the length of the jet's fuselage, steady and unmistakable, and the entire room seemed to stop breathing at once. Connor, desperate to prove the moment was not unique to Mason alone, attempted to replicate the exact sequence himself moments later, but the system rejected him without hesitation, exactly as it had rejected every other attempt over the previous days. Mason explained quietly that the aircraft was not responding to him out of any personal preference. It was responding because he remained the only person in the building who still carried the complete, unaltered recovery sequence in his memory, a sequence that had never been fully transferred to anyone else, before his removal from the project years earlier. Amelia asked him to continue, her voice low but certain, and Jackson, sensing the walls closing in around him, made a sudden move toward a secondary data terminal, attempting to pull a storage drive from the panel before anyone could examine its contents. David Mercer intercepted him immediately, blocking his path and exposing in front of the recording cameras clear evidence that Jackson had previously altered the original accident logs to redirect blame away from himself. With the recovery sequence fully restored, Mason moved forward and engaged the primary turbine ignition. The Aegis jet roared to life after days of complete silence, its engines building steadily into a deep, controlled thunder that shook the floor of the hangar and rattled the loose equipment still scattered near the walls. Engineers who had spent days insisting the aircraft was simply broken stood frozen, watching lights ripple across every panel in perfect sequence, the machine finally behaving exactly as it had been designed to behave from the very beginning. The sound filled every corner of Hangar 9, drowning out the murmurs of disbelief and replacing them with something closer to reverence. Amelia turned toward Mason as the turbine settled into a steady, powerful hum, and the look she gave him carried none of the detached authority she had walked in with that morning. For the first time since this entire crisis began, she was looking at him not as a contractor she had once dismissed, but as the only person who had ever truly understood what this aircraft was built to protect. The defense delegation, having witnessed the entire sequence unfold on camera, demanded a clear explanation for why an engineer previously erased from the company's official records had been the only person capable of restoring the aircraft to operation. Amelia faced a decision that would shape far more than the outcome of a single contract, choosing between protecting the company's polished public image or allowing the full truth to surface in front of everyone present. Eleanor Grant urged her quietly to describe the entire situation as a simple internal documentation error, a phrase vague enough to satisfy reporters without raising further questions. Amelia looked toward Mason, standing near the now steadily humming jet, and made her decision without further hesitation. She addressed the delegation directly, acknowledging openly that Langford Aerospace had benefited for years from a critical engineering design without ever properly crediting the man who created it. David Mercer stepped forward and provided the original archived files, confirming clearly that Mason had developed the protective identification protocol that ultimately safeguarded the aircraft from unauthorized control. Jackson's manipulation of the original accident logs was laid out plainly before the delegation, exposing how he had redirected blame onto Mason and his former team years earlier in order to advance his own position within the company. Connor, who had spent days dismissing Mason's expertise, surprised many in the room by admitting publicly that his own highly trained team had been unable to understand the aircraft's deeper systems without Mason's direct guidance. Mason did not gloat or revel in the reversal taking place around him. Instead, he made a single request, asking only that the names of the engineers wrongfully removed from the original project finally be restored to the historical record. The defense delegation, satisfied with the transparency shown and the technical competence demonstrated, chose not to cancel the contract, though they did require a full safety restructuring and insisted that Mason be placed in a senior technical oversight role moving forward. Amelia agreed immediately, without negotiation or hesitation, recognizing that this was both the right decision and the only one that made sense given everything that had come to light. Jackson was suspended on the spot and referred for a formal internal investigation, his career unraveling in the same hangar where he had once mocked the very man now standing at its center. As the meeting dispersed and engineers slowly returned to their stations, Mason remained beside the jet, no longer positioned at the edge of the room where he had spent years standing quietly out of sight. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, he stood at the center of Hangar 9, in the exact place he had always belonged, a position the company had taken far too long to recognize and had nearly lost everything trying to avoid admitting. Outside, the rain that had hung over the city for days finally broke into thin streaks of afternoon light filtering through the hangar's high windows, catching on the polished surface of the jet's fuselage and scattering across the concrete floor below. Members of the delegation lingered a while longer than necessary, speaking quietly among themselves about the unusual morning they had just witnessed, while staff who had worked alongside Mason for years exchanged glances that carried something between relief and quiet shame. None of them said much out loud, but the shift in the room was unmistakable, a current of respect finally settling where dismissal had lived for far too long. With the system properly restored and fully documented this time, the Aegis jet was scheduled for its long-delayed test flight, an event the entire company had been working toward for months under increasingly desperate circumstances. Mason had no interest in becoming the public face of the moment, preferring instead to focus on ensuring that the mistakes of the previous days would never be repeated by anyone else who eventually worked on the aircraft. Before dawn, Amelia found him alone in the hangar, checking connections one final time with the same quiet thoroughness he had always brought to the work, regardless of who was watching. She did not offer an apology dressed up in corporate language this time. Instead, she handed him a formal document restoring his original engineering title, granting him recognized ownership of his technical contributions, and authorizing a full financial settlement that reflected years of unpaid recognition. Mason read through the pages slowly but did not sign immediately, taking his time the way he approached everything that actually mattered to him. Amelia told him plainly that she understood respect could not be purchased outright, that it could only begin with honesty, something the company had failed to offer him for far too long. Mason agreed to take on the role of lead technical advisor for the program, but only under one condition, insisting that every young engineer brought onto the project afterward be allowed to ask questions freely, even of senior leadership, without fear of being dismissed the way he once had been. Amelia accepted the condition without argument, recognizing it as a small but meaningful correction to a culture that had clearly allowed talented people to be overlooked for far too long. As the sun rose fully over the runway, the test flight finally began. The Aegis jet accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the morning sky, drawing a wave of applause from everyone gathered inside Hangar 9, a sound that carried genuine relief rather than rehearsed celebration. Connor stood quietly among the crowd watching the aircraft climb, and for the first time since arriving at the company lowered his head respectfully toward Mason, the gesture of a man finally willing to learn from someone he had once dismissed without a second thought. David Mercer, standing near the back of the hangar, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, knowing that the names of his original team had finally been restored where they belonged. Mason's phone buzzed briefly with a short message from home, a quiet reminder of the life waiting for him outside the walls of the hangar, though his attention stayed fixed on the aircraft cutting cleanly through the morning clouds. Amelia watched the jet rise higher and higher, the white trail behind it stretching steadily across the pale sky, and understood with complete clarity that the company had not been saved by the engineering team that cost the most money, but by the one person everyone else had been too quick to overlook. Below the aircraft, the hangar slowly emptied as engineers returned to their stations and the visiting officials departed for their next meeting. But a quieter shift remained behind in the people who had witnessed the morning unfold. Several of the younger staff lingered near Mason, asking careful questions about the recovery sequence, questions he answered patiently without any trace of the resentment he might have justifiably carried. It was, in its own understated way, the beginning of something the company had needed for a very long time, a willingness to listen to the people who actually understood the machines they built. A few weeks later, Langford Aerospace held an internal gathering, not to showcase new technology, but to correct a piece of its own history that had remained unspoken for far too long. The names of Mason Reed and his original engineering team were formally added to a recognition board dedicated to the Aegis program, a quiet but permanent acknowledgement of work that had once been erased without explanation. Amelia introduced a new company-wide policy requiring that all meaningful technical contributions be documented transparently, regardless of whether the person responsible wore a tailored suit or a worn maintenance jacket. Mason did not let the recognition change who he was. He still arrived at the hangar early each morning, still walked the length of every aircraft listening for sounds most people would never notice, still treated the work with the same quiet seriousness he always had, success or no success. The only real difference now was that when he crossed the hangar floor, no one referred to him as temporary help anymore, and no one spoke about him with the careless dismissal that had once defined his presence there. Eleanor Grant, never one for sentiment, admitted privately that genuine loyalty could not be purchased for $50 million, no matter how impressive the credentials attached to the price tag. Connor, humbled by everything he had witnessed, asked formally to study the Aegis systems from the beginning under Mason's direct guidance, a request Mason accepted without hesitation or lingering resentment. It was, in its own way, a far more meaningful outcome than any apology could have offered. One quiet afternoon, Amelia found herself standing beside Mason near the jet, neither of them speaking for a long stretch of time, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. There was something unspoken settling in that pause, a sense that whatever came next between them did not need to be rushed or defined too quickly, only allowed to exist honestly. Mason finally broke the silence, saying simply that a machine like this did not only need someone capable of starting it, but someone who would never betray the purpose it was built to serve. Amelia nodded slowly, watching the late light move across the curve of the wing, and thought about how close the company had come to losing everything by chasing the loudest voice in the room instead of the steadiest one. She thought, too, of how easily a person's worth could be measured by the wrong things entirely, by titles and price tags and polished credentials, when the truest measure had been standing quietly at the edge of the hangar the whole time, waiting patiently for someone to finally look in the right direction. The hangar lights reflected steadily across the polished surface of the Aegis jet as the afternoon faded into evening, no longer a symbol of corporate ambition or a billion-dollar gamble, but proof of something far simpler and far more durable. Truth, once restored to its rightful place, had a way of starting things that money alone never could. If hidden secrets buried inside a hangar full of broken trust speak to you, stay close, the truth lands soon.